starting to actual production much more efficiently and quickly, and you can end up then just leveraging that from your code. You can easily trigger these logic apps with simple HTTP post, or you could also use recurring schedule. There's also other triggers we'll talk about here in a minute. You can use these to orchestrate standalone solutions, but you could also make it part of a larger workflow where you can chain a couple of logic apps together or call their Azure functions or whatever you need to do. With the connectors that we'll learn about, you'll talk about how we could get the connectors to integrate with other critical areas of Azure, such as your storage, key vaults, functions, APIs, SQL, Security Center, the Azure Monitor, and more. And so connectors can easily integrate outside solutions as well. And we'll see in my example here, we're going to connect and use a Twitter trigger basically. And then you could also use Office 365, SendGrid, Slack, Teams, Twilio, Facebook, Instagram, SharePoint, MailChimp, SAP. All of these different connectors are out there. So if something goes wrong when you're working with the Logic app, the versions of the Logic app are actually stored in Azure, so you can revert to a previous version of the Logic app just by pushing a button. You could also easily export the JSON, that's the code behind for the Logic app, and store that in a Git repository. It's a little bit clunky to do it that way, but you can actually do it, and that way you have a quick version history that you could easily use that way. You can use these, also you can do them directly from the portal, or if you'd like to, you can use a Visual Studio add-in that allows you to use Logic apps. Now, personally, I've not had much luck with the Visual Studio Logic app extension, mostly because it immediately deploys things and it's a little bit harder to use the drag and drop in Visual Studio than it is at the portal. So you can also export your ARM templates for your easy deployment. Once you've built a Logic app, you just export the template, and that way you can go from environment to environment with parameters and variables. And then you add alerts to these and log analytics to these so that you can easily monitor what they're doing and get notifications when things aren't necessarily going smoothly. So here what we're seeing is I'm just going to go get started. I already have a Logic App Playground resource group and a log analytics workspace built. So there's a couple different ways to get to Logic apps. You see here, I'm just going to show a couple of them quickly. You could type Logic apps here. You could also do it up in the search bar up above and get to the Logic apps. This is usually how I go places in Azure, is this search bar at the top. It seems to work nicely. So here I'm creating a new Logic app. And so I'm going to put it in a resource group here that I already created. You could create a new one if you wanted to. And, of course, save that if you wanted, but this one will just use the one we have. What's most important is the name. Once you name your Logic app, you can't really rename it. So if you want to rename it, you kind of have to clone it and then rename it that way. So the integration service environment is really interesting because this is what you want to use if you want to deploy to allow a private VPN. Log analytics, of course, is just your monitoring behind the scenes, but that integration services environment gives you the ability to do things like an on-prem data gateway for a hybrid environment. It avoids using reverse proxy. It allows you to do dedicated hardware, compute, and storage for your Logic apps, and you can also do custom domain names. So when you're naming your Logic app, make sure that you use a unique name, because once you again save it, then it's basically going to be stuck with that name forever. There's not a lot to do here. It's basically just name it and then go ahead and save it. Once that's done, I'll get the Logic app created here. I'm just reviewing it, making sure it's in the right resource group name and location that I wanted it deployed to. Central US is where I'm at, so that's the closest to me. So then you go ahead and deploy it. And once you deploy it, then you're ready to start building out your Logic app. So the entry point for every Logic app are triggers, and triggers start the process off, and they can you can do things like scheduled triggers that you can use to run on a time schedule. You can also respond to events from within Azure. You can respond to things at social media, which we'll see here in a little bit. And you can also do things like when emails arrive or just a simple HTTP post. So if you have a process you need to separate from an application, you could easily create a Logic app that's triggered by an HTTP post and then just trigger it with your code, passing the payload you need for your Logic app to fire. So the commonest triggers, or the most common triggers that you're going to have for Logic apps are pretty similar to the Azure Functions triggers. If you're familiar with those at all, they're kind of the same group of things. But basically, The main ones you'll likely use are going to be your HTTP request, recurrence triggers for timing, or you might respond to something at an event grid event. But again, there are many ways that you can actually kick things off. An example in this, we'll actually be using a recurrence trigger to search on Twitter hashtag every 10 minutes to see if something's been hashed. And I wish I would have done the GameStop stock because I think we get a lot more tweets, but anyway, so the nice thing is once you get started, if you don't really know anything about Logic Apps, or if you have a process that you're like, I'd really just like to do this, you could go look at the templates. There's actually quite a few templates, and you push a button and you literally have a Logic app pre-built, and you just have to configure certain things like the connections. So there's quite a few different templates. We'll hopefully see a few of those here in a second. And it really, once you push the button, it's just, configure it from that point on. So here what you can see is I'm going into the designer. There's also the code view. We'll take a look at that here just to show there's nothing in it right now, but that will actually hold the code. But here we'll have our designer. This is where the triggers, the main triggers are that I just showed, and that tweet is posted. That's what we'll use. But you can start blank. You can do, like I said, there's lots of different pre-built templates here. So you can see if you wanted to do an HTTP request response, or if you wanted to do any of these other things that's listed here. Maybe you want to do something from SAP, or you want to do something from Security Center to trigger a Logic app. So really cool stuff that you can do to set up quick alerts or processes to handle things. You can also filter them. And so here you see I'm just doing some basic filtering just to kind of see what it looks like if I just want to use social stuff. So again, lots and lots of templates to choose from. And then ultimately what I'm going to do is just go ahead and choose the Twitter trigger here in a second. So when a new tweet is posted, and so once I do that, then the first thing I need to do is actually sign into Twitter within my Logic app so that it knows who I am. So every trigger that you have will need a configuration. Once that trigger is set, you'll have to configure it, whether it's signing into the third party as we're doing here for Twitter. You might have to set some recurrence times. You might have to do things like tell the body of the HTTP request what you want the incoming payload to look like with JSON. And so it's actually very easy to configure all these things. They've really taken all that into account well. So this failed right here for me because I was doing it in incognito mode. Once I realized that, I just turned off incognito mode and it started working just fine. So I got connected. So here, once it was connected, I put in my Star Trek Discovery hashtag that I'm searching for, and I told it to look every 10 minutes or so. And basically, you can see that you can set any times there, and you can add other parameters if you need to on your triggers here, such as the time zone or the start time. So I just went ahead and put this to Central Time, Central US time, which is GMT +6 right now. So I'm 7 in the morning, and you guys are 1 in the afternoon, which is really fun. Oh crap! Don't scroll the mouse. All right. So sorry about that. So then I save it here, and we're good to go. So once I have a trigger in place, then the next thing I'm going to need is connectors and actions. And so connectors are the lifeblood of how you get different services. So much like a binding in an Azure function, if you're familiar with that, a connector allows you to tell the Logic app what service or solution to connect to. Things like Office 365 Outlook, a SQL database, a Cosmos database, Key Vault, Service Bus, even Azure Functions have connectors built in. In fact, there's over 200 built-in connectors in these Logic apps that you can easily choose from. But if you can't find what you're looking for, that's not a problem. You just go ahead and create your own. And perhaps you might need to have a custom connection to an on-premises service or something that you need database on service on your local service that needs a custom something done. You can create a connector for it, and you're able to use that in your solution. So here we're going to do a quick connection to Azure Key Vault to get the SendGrid API key that I use to send emails. And so we could, of course, use a SendGrid connector to do this very easily, but I wanted to do Key Vault. I wanted to obscure my API key a little bit. It will be visible behind the scenes. Once I run the Logic app, the SendGrid value that I print out here will be shown. But you can see I'm just able to easily connect to my Key Vault and select one of my secrets. And so again, one other thing you want to do is rename your stuff well as you go, because once you start chaining things together, the names are harder to change because they actually tell things how to depend on the variables and the stuff that's being returned. And so here, I'm going to create a variable to hold that SendGrid API key. And that SendGrid API key is just going to be a string, and it's just going to be the value that's returned from the secret. Now, technically, the value of the secret is already in the get SendGrid API key. I don't really need this variable or this action, but it makes it a lot easier for me to see it as a human and to show it. So I did a lot of extra variables here that you wouldn't necessarily need, but with that, just keep that in mind when you're programming stuff out. Once you have it, it's there. It's just, do you want to have a bunch of things pointing to value, or do you want to have a bunch of things that are pointing to something like the variable name you just saw me create? So in addition to the connectors you've already seen, there are a number of other connectors you could use. They're easy to search for. When you pull them up, you're basically looking for the connectors that are out there. You see that some that are built in, some that are enterprise, and some even have a spot for the custom. So you can create your own custom connectors. But you see all kinds of different connectors there. The built-in ones are going to be your functions, your services, your logic apps. Your standard ones that are your data, your storage, your SQL. Enterprise are going to be your MQ and your IBM 3270 and your SAP, and the custom, of course, is yours. And of course, permissions are important, security is important, and so we want to make sure to be aware of that. So every logic app you create is actually stored in storage, and it's encrypted at rest. So it automatically requires TLS 1.2 to connect to it to use it, if you're using HTTP posts, for example. And so you have kind of your basic encryption in place, but you can actually do things like create shared access signatures around the logic app to allow specific people to only be able to call them during a time window. You can use keys to make the specific URL and get that from the REST API in order to to authorize your logic app using one of those specific keys in the URL. You can use Azure Active Directory authentication. You can also use API management as a gateway, and so your customers would come in through API management and then only really just call a function at the API management, which would trigger your logic app. You can also restrict the inbound IP addresses if you really need to. And so going the other way, once I have my authorized people in, the people that I want, or the logic app that I want to use exactly here is going to go out to my key vault. So I need to be able to allow my logic app to authenticate against my key vault and have the permissions it needs. So I'll make a managed identity for the logic app, and then I'll be able to use that in the access policies in the actual key vault to say that this person is actually authorized to do what they need to do. So we'll just go down and find the identity, turn it on, save it, and then when you go to the key vault, there's actually a couple different things you could do. You can actually specifically allow all of your logic apps to do things, or you can say this specific logic app, which is what we'll do in this demo. We'll have just one specific logic app get permission to authenticate against the key vault there. So again, here we're just going to go do that. We're going to set the identity for the actual logic app, and all we do is just turn it on and save it as a system managed identity. We don't have to do anything else, which is nice. Once that's done, then I can go out to my key vault and do my access policies. So the trickiest thing about the access policy is that it's a double save. And so a lot of times I've thought I've added the policy and then it didn't save because I forgot to push save. So I'll show you that in a second here. But you have all the different choices for key vault. Basically, we're just going to give basic get permission on secrets. So they have to know the name of the secret. They can't list them. They can't do anything there. We'll just use that principle that we just created from the Twitter Monitor logic app to allow that. So go ahead and select that identity with this get permission and add it. And if you don't hit save here, it doesn't actually save. So you see it in the list and you think you're done, you navigate away, you come, go run your logic app, it doesn't work. Make sure you actually saved your access policy. All right. So yeah, this was just validating that that identity was there. So we're good to go. So once my logic app is doing what it's supposed to do, now it's time to actually build it. And so I need to figure out how to make this thing work. And so here you can see kind of the mostly completed process to respond when a tweet is posted. And it's going to use a parallel branch to split and work in parallel so that I can speed up some of the processing. The left-hand side here is going to go out and get secrets from Key Vault, while the right-hand side is just basically responding and creating variables on the tweet. Again, those variables are really kind of unnecessary, a little bit syntactic fluff here for this demo. You could go without them and just use the tweet value itself in your composition of the body here in a second. But it is important as you go, make sure you're naming your actions well and right away, because once you leverage that action in a subsequent action, you can no longer rename it usually, because it's basically saying this is the SendGrid template ID's value that I've used. And if I try to change the get SendGrid template ID, then it starts messing with where's that value coming from. So here I'm just going to create a parallel branch and allow me to respond to the incoming Twitter variables. And so you can see it's very easy to rename and start using variables here. So I'm going to do tweet ID, and it's just going to be the tweet ID value that's dynamic from the actual tweet. But again, I have this already, so I didn't necessarily need this variable. I could have just used this same exact dynamic content later when I composed the body for my email or my Cosmos. And so there's just a couple here. So I just did a couple just to kind of reiterate the process. Essentially, you're just creating new variables here. And you want to make sure that you are limiting your variables a little bit, because we'll see it here in the pricing model. That's actually what's going to cost me money later on, the more actions that I have. So here, by having these extra actions, I'm actually running up a charge that I probably don't need just to be human readable. So it's important to plan well for that as you go. So here I've gotten a lot of the stuff done. So now it's time to recombine. So just at the bottom, I click on the new step, and basically I'm going to build out now this variable here. This is just the SendGrid API, which I could have got from Key Vault. I could have basically used the SendGrid connector itself and just put the key in that SendGrid connector, or the value here that I just entered for the SendGrid API. So I'm just composing it manually versus using the built-in connector. And ultimately, here I'm going to build out the payload. And so this is probably the trickiest part of the whole thing, is making the payload, because I have to put some JSON in this value that I'm going to post ultimately to SendGrid's API to send an email. And so this is kind of wonky, to be honest. I'm sitting here typing JSON into a text box, and then I'm pulling in things like the from email that I've already reconfigured from my Key Vault. So I went out and made a variable from Key Vault to get the email I'm sending it to. And now I have to basically compose all the information about the templates and the payload that I want to send with this post. And so ultimately what I did was I put it into Notepad, and I'll just copy and paste it in here in a second. So you don't have to watch me type the whole thing over, it can get really interesting here as we go. So, but you can see it's very easy to pull in your previous variables or values and use those in your payload. So here's the completed payload. You can see I was able to use the stuff that I already had to get the from email, the to email, and then I have the template data that SendGrid needs in order to send the email correctly. And I put that into this payload variable, which then I can use when I post to SendGrid in a moment. So here I'm going to post to SendGrid. So I'm going to use an HTTP request, and I'm just going to do a post. And you can see all the different options there. You post the URI you want. So I did put this into that URI variable just to make it easier. I could have typed it there. And the headers that you want to put. So here's an authorization bearer token using the SendGrid API key that I used to post to my SendGrid account. And you'll see in a second, I actually had a couple of problems with this, and which is good because it gives me a chance to show some stuff. Application JSON, and then the body, which is just that payload. But I have to put it inside of a JSON expression. So I use this expression JSON, and then I'm going to wrap the string of my JSON so that it knows it's a JSON content and converts it to JSON for us. So you see it just uses that variable's payload, and then it looks like JSON there. If you expand it again, you can see it's using that payload variable. So that sets up my post to SendGrid. And so this was a really good chance to test to see, okay, well, how far have I gotten? Have I made some mistakes? Is everything working? And of course, things didn't work, which is actually really good because that gives me a chance to show you how to troubleshoot some of this stuff. So here I had some issues. First of all, my Twitter didn't connect, so I had to reconnect because it must have timed out or something. So I fixed that. The next thing I had a problem with was the API key for SendGrid was all wonky, so I had to change that. And the third thing I did wrong was I forgot to actually set the value on this variable, and so it wasn't sending to the emails. And so I can go into the run history here, and I can see everything that went wrong. And so you see the green checks show me good, the red exclamation says it went wrong, and here you see I didn't have a valid address. So there again, I had forgotten to put the to address, so I fixed that. And then this one here had an issue where it said that I was not authorized to send mail. So my API key didn't have the authorization it needed. So I was able to quickly go fix that. And then I was just checking this one to see if there was another issue I could show. But basically, once you have your errors, you can see what's happening. Now I'm just going to run it again, having it fixed, and hopefully this time it works. And you see that this time it did. So there's all the 4 times it succeeded on that run. There were 4 hashtags. And when you dive into the details again, you can see everything that was uncovered. So here's the tweet ID for the Twitter tweet that was happening. Here's who did it. It was by Billy with art pads. And the text that they posted, which was, I feel like it's been a while since I've drawn, so here's some stuff with the Star Trek Discovery hashtag. So you can see all of the details are easily see there. There's the email. I was able to get the email in my inbox just from the SendGrid API call. So you already see some of the things I could leverage here. You know, you might not be responding to Twitter, but if you did an HTTP post and you needed to email somebody via SendGrid, like a client, you could easily create a logic app, do this exact same process, and just trigger it from your code. So in the process of orchestrating, you might come into a situation where you want to actually create a chain of processes. So the one thing I would say is to be careful here, because you could actually overwhelm your own servers or other servers, depending on how you set these up. You want to make sure that you have your retry policies in place correctly and that you don't send a bunch of parallel calls to the same server, or you could end up having a lot of logic apps running. So you have to choose whether or not you want to wait for a response. And here you actually do use the HTTP trigger on the chained logic app. That's the easiest way to do it. And you just set the JSON body of what the new logic app needs to have passed to it, and then you'll be able to easily configure it. So what I'm going to do is add another parallel branch here, and I'm going to create a parallel branch to post to a new logic app, which will then save the tweet data into Cosmos DB. So here I'm going to connect to another pre-configured app that I already had, which was store tweet info. And you see that the payload body tells me I need to pass all this information to it in order for this to trigger correctly. And so I'm easily able to pass the variables I already have from this logic app into that payload of the HTTP post to my other logic app. And so you also can add other parameters here, such as headers or anything else you wanted to add there. So if you need to add more information, authorization headers or whatever it might be. And so then I'm just going to rename this to trigger the store tweet info logic app, so it's just a little more useful. So I'm going to run it again, and this time I'm going to actually trigger my logic app for the saving to Cosmos. And you can see that this failed. And it failed because I don't have a response. So basically it's saying I wanted to wait for a response, but my logic app didn't actually tell it was done. So it said it failed. So I'll go into my other logic app. This is my store tweet, and it's basically just use the incoming information, and it's failing. And the reason it was failing was because I forgot to put an ID in the payload to the document. So you see the input content doesn't have the ID property. So I had named my partition tweet ID, and I forgot that I could have just used ID here. So I'll just quickly add to that an ID that essentially is the same as the tweet ID, and so that it will work. But you could, reconfigure or figure that out as you go what you want it to be. So basically, I'm just going to duplicate the tweet ID. And one other trick, that partition key value there that's passed to the Cosmos DB, that's probably the trickiest part. It needs to be in quotes, and it needs to be the value. And here you see I'm just adding a 200 response, and I can create my own body that I want to send back on that. So now I'll send back to the other one that I've successfully responded, and here's the tweet ID that was handled if you wanted to use that for whatever reason. So once I get this fixed, then of course, when I run my Twitter monitor again this time, and you can run it running the trigger, or you can go directly into it and run it. If you do it this way, it will wait until it actually executes. Here, it just so happens somebody tweeted and it responded. And so this time it was able to go and trigger that logic app that saved to Cosmos DB. And you can see the information that was passed to that logic app and the response that I got back. And then I go here and I look and see what happened, and you can see that it easily went through and it parsed out the JSON to grab all the information, put those into a couple of variables I wanted, composed the document the way I wanted it to, and then posted that to my Cosmos DB. And so easily able to store that information in Cosmos. And of course, you don't have to use Cosmos. You could do anything else with that data you wanted to do, of course. The other thing about this that I didn't mention is that by creating the second logic app with an HTTP trigger, I can easily test this part of the chain with Postman. I just set the Postman to point to my URL, as long as I have the permissions, which right now there are no permissions locking it down. And then the payload that I expect, I can easily hit that and trigger this part of the chain without having to wait for a tweet or whatever else the first part of the chain is. Of course, as a programmer, you probably wonder, well, what do I do if this happens or that happens? And Logic Apps has you handled. They got conditional logic built in, so you can do things when certain conditions fail or processes fail. You can set up a number of retries for things like an HTTP post or a call to another Logic app. You can use loops, switches, if-else conditions. And the one thing I'll say here is you need to be very careful, because again, what's going to happen is your cost and your pricing, and we'll see in a second, is based on the number of actions you execute. And if you create an infinite loop that never ends, you could likely run up a very large bill. However, one thing that I've run into in the real world, we did a post to a third-party API, and it had an automatic retry policy that we didn't even bother to worry about. And we ended up running some stuff against some data, and it triggered a bunch of logic apps to run because there was a bunch of data, and we called their API too many times, and they basically blocked us. And our logic app continued to retry even though we were blocked. And so we ended up running like $100 bill, which isn't a lot. Luckily, this was in test, not in production. But $100 spent just trying to do something that you couldn't do is really, really not fun. So you need to be careful to make sure that you limit the retries. And I've even done things which is kind of wonky, but put a check on the loop itself. The loop does have a maximum count of iterations, I think, that you can set directly. But I've done things like a counter variable. I just said if this counter variable in a condition is greater than 10, exit the loop. We're done. Something went wrong. So this is again going to be just contrived a little bit, but we're going to respond to the logic app, whether or not it was successful in a condition, and then we could do whatever we wanted to from there. And so basically we're going to add an action to do that. Here I was just showing that you could also do it off of the status code of the HTTP post or whatever you wanted to do on this side if you needed to do more conditional logic on that side. So back in the designer here, I'm just going to add an action for a control. And the controls are going to be where you have, first I'm going to parse it out to get the actual JSON from the response. So the body of that came in, and that body had that success and then the tweet ID. So that's the payload that I'm basically telling it to expect there. And then it knows how to create variables based on those. So the parse JSON now has a success and a tweet ID. And again, I create an extra variable here just to be, because I'm a human and I want to see it, but I could have just used the value from the parse JSON as well. This is an extra step I didn't really need. As soon as I have that success that you see there, I could use that anywhere. But now I have a variable called logic app success that I can use later, manipulate or whatever I want to do. So here I'm going to create a control. Controls are where you have all your conditions, your loops. You have a terminate control, a switch, an until control. So a number of different things that you could do to respond here. And we're going to respond to the success variable. And I said is equal to true. And of course, this doesn't work. I'm going to have to end up using a string contains thing here in a second. But what it ended up trying to do true here, it never fires. And you'll see that when I run this, it actually just kind of goes off into oblivion, which is, again, another chance to kind of show how to troubleshoot and look at things a little differently. So, and the condition here, basically, we're just going to do some, here's the official tweet ID. Again, this is contrived just to show we can respond to things working when it's working the way we wanted it to. So, oh yeah, and I also wanted to show that if you're going to use a variable inside a condition, you have to initialize it outside of the loop or outside of the if condition. If you try to do that inside, it'll say you can't initialize a variable. So you initialize it outside and you set it inside, which is a little bit also one of those gotchas that you just have to kind of get used to if you're, used to developing and just being able to create variables wherever you want to. And so here I wasn't really sure what to do. Ultimately, I'm just going to choose a termination. So it'll just, if it fails, it fails. And again, this is a little bit contrived here, but you could do whatever you wanted at this point. And if it fails, I'm going to say it's error code 10434, whatever that means, and then send a message the tweet wasn't stored or whatever, so that you could respond to that later. And here's just basically, showing that it comes back together again after the condition and the HTTP is done, so I can come back together and continue on with my logic app if I wanted to do that. So then I run it and it fails on the condition here because my condition is actually going to be wrong for the set of the variable. This is again just showing I could continue to add more stuff here if I wanted to, even though I'd already completed the loop or whatever the recombination, I could still do this here. And I'm just going to throw that out because we don't want it. It's just a example. So now my logic app's ready to go. And when I run it, I'm going to get a little bit of an error. So a couple things that we need to really kind of look at then when we're talking about being careful. Again, we want to make sure that we handle concurrency because these logic apps could be fired indefinitely as many times as we need to. And we need to make sure we don't allow the whole world to fall apart if we send, like I said, a whole bunch of requests to somebody else's API because we triggered 1,000 of these things without thinking about it. So you can use concurrency control to make sure that you can set a number of concurrent application runs. So you could even set this just to 1 and make sure it's synchronous. So only one instance of this Twitter logic app or one instance of this logic app would be able to run at a time. Or you could say, I want to run no more than 5 at the same time, for example. So you can use that concurrency there. All right, so in here, I'm checking back. So I failed. And the reason I failed, again, I had a wrong condition here. So I had to fix that condition. I did have the information I wanted. So I was looking at that. The success value was true, but the condition got canceled. And I wasn't really sure why. So I went back in and I just changed the condition to respond to the contains. So now that contains true in the string. And now this time when I run it, it's going to work just fine. So again, just one of those tricky things you kind of have to figure out as you go. What's the way to look for different results or variables or values? And then it was able to run the way that I expected once I had that condition working. So a couple things to look at here. When I go into the settings on the HTTP request here, you can also move what it runs after. That's what that configure run after is. But I'm going to go into the settings here. And you see that here's where I can do things like the asynchronous pattern. And this allows me to make sure that I wait for it to complete before I move on, or I just go ahead and go. And here's my retry policy. So again, I want to make sure I set the correct retry policy in place. And if my retry policy is not right, that's where I can cause some problems calling someone else's HTTP request or whatever it might be. I have the same settings available on the call to the other logic app. I turned off the asynchronous pattern here, started messing around with the retry policy a little bit, and you can see that you have to use that weird notation, ISO notation for the retry interval. So this is supposed to be 500 seconds, I think. I save this and try to run it, and it fails because of the asynchronous pattern on the Logic app here. So here I'm going to run it, wait for someone to tweet with Star Trek Discovery hashtag, and they did. And if I scroll down a little bit here, we'll see that it actually failed on the condition. The create official tweet ID condition is not satisfied. Actual value was empty. And so basically I decided that I broke it with my trying to make the Logic app asynchronous. So I went back into the settings here and turned that back to just being in the synchronous pattern. And then I save that and I run it and it works just fine. So it worked as expected. So this is just a bigger look at the entire process, just kind of zoomed out a little bit so you could do that and to be able to just kind of get a view of what your stuff is supposed to do. So with the code there, we were doing everything in the designer view, but there is the code view. You can also export your ARM template from your Logic app very easily, just like any other Azure service, you can export it. And so this is useful for group deployments to other environments. But you may need to worry about your connections and such if you do that. So here I have a connection to Twitter. If I export that to a new environment, will it still have the same connection, or do I have to go in and reconfigure it once the deployment's completed? So you just have to be aware of that sort of thing. And you may be able to preset those using the APIs that they're actually leveraging. The connections themselves aren't stored in the Logic app. They're stored in an API connection, and then it's leveraged through the code in the Logic app. So here I'm also just going to show it's easy to go into the JSON. So now that I've created this whole entire process, you see the JSON. And again, this is why the names are so important, because everything is basically named with these weird, like trigger the store tweet info, tweet ID, and things like that. So you see how if you change those, it could become really tricky for the environment to understand where you just move things around. But what I'm showing is that I can go into this code view and I can modify anything. So if I wanted to do, for example, Bernie Sanders, which was big on Sunday, not so big today. I still wish I would have done the GameStop stock there. But you see that if I change it here and save it, then if I go back to my code view, which is available on the top or the left, then I'll go find my tweet and you can see that it's been changed here, and vice versa. If I change it back here and save it, it has the same effect. It changed it back here. So easy way to quickly modify things either in the action or in the code. And here's just exporting the template. You can see I can download that, and then I can use that in order to be able to connect and deploy. So you see here, different settings that are up there for the resources, and here's the parameters for the actual template itself. There's the parameters for the template. And so, yeah, basically just a quick ARM template that's able to easily deploy this Logic app to a different environment with different parameters if I wanted to. The one thing about that is that it does have a subscription ID in there, and that subscription ID would be a problem if you move it to another environment. You saw this subscription ID there briefly, but that's just the exported template. And you can see different IDs that might cause you problems along the way if you try to move across subscriptions or tenants. So when it comes down to monitoring your Logic apps, basically you just need to be able to review them. And so you can see what failed. We already did that. You can also port stuff to log analytics and run queries, and you can set up an automated alert. And so here's just kind of another quick view of some things that failed, just to see, or things that worked, just to kind of show that again, even though we've already seen it. And here I'm just going to set up an alert quickly to basically respond if this thing fails and send it to an action group. So I'll go out here and I'll just easily add a condition for when the runs failed. So if it fails, I can then set an aggregation on this. So here's, greater than total of 5 in the last however, and then it'll send me an email. So then I have to create my action group since I don't have one. If you had an action group already in place for your support team or whatever, you could easily just leverage that here. This is just me creating it because I didn't have one set up. And then you name the rule, kind of put a description in there if you want. And then these weird severities, I don't know if you guys have schemas on how you use these severities, but basically they're just numbers. And I think they wanted them to be more like the lower the number, the higher the severity, but I'm not really sure. It's just a bunch of numbers. So you use those appropriately. Here's just me adding my email. So I'm adding an email SMS to my action group. So here's just me adding my email. You can't type my own email address. But that way, if the alert fails or triggers, it will then send it to me and I'll know, hey, I need to do something. This is how you can notify your support team. Of course, log analytics shows you how many times your Logic app has run and failed. It shows you different information about the different tweets, or excuse me, I see tweets, the Logic apps that ran, the numbers on the metrics on those. It talks about how many actions were fired. So you see 34 actions, 36 total actions, which that again is going to be important when it comes down to pricing. And so here's just the alerts again, basically showing, here's some alerts that have fired to make sure that it worked. When it comes down to pricing, this is all taken from the documentation. Just look for Logic App pricing. You should be able to find this very easily. But basically, each action runs a fraction of a penny, whatever that number is, 25 ten thousandths or 100 thousandths of a penny or of a cent or whatever, of a dollar. I don't know. Anyway, each connector is a little more expensive. And an enterprise connector, if you build your own, is going to be a little bit more. Or if you're connecting to SAP, or IBM 3270s or 3270 or whatever it is, those are those enterprise connectors. You'll pay a storage fee, which is less than a couple pennies a month for gigabyte. So you're really not going to run up a lot of cost there. As long as you never run them, they wouldn't really cost you anything. And then, of course, if you do the integrated service environment, it does actually change the pricing schema. Now you're running $1.03 per hour or $6.64 per hour if you run on the premium. You can do a scaled plan that's half of that price. And of course, the integration account allows you to do some more things with like EDI, certificates, assemblies, things like that. So you can, again, look for that information to do more of that as you need to. So the last thing I really want to touch on is the new Logic apps. These are currently in preview. And again, I'm not a super expert on these yet, but basically what you see is they've now kind of decided that Logic apps should work more like Azure Functions, which is really interesting. They'll have an app service plan that backs them, which they do have the free option, but they'll also then be able to group Logic apps into the Logic app itself. So they basically started out as called workflows. They changed them to Logic apps, and now you have a Logic app that has workflows. So neat. But basically, it gives you the chance to kind of group them. Like a function app has a group of functions. Now you can have a Logic app that has a group of workflows. And you can do two different types. One is stateful and one is stateless. And so depending on which way you want to do it, you set up the different Logic app workflow and then choose stateful or stateless, and then you can use things appropriately. So what I found, one thing that was interesting was that in the stateful is where I can use variables, whereas the stateless I can't. And it feels to me like they don't have all the connectors and all the information that we had on the original Logic apps in place yet. But again, it is in preview. So here what I did was went and I created a Logic app that's a preview. And so this is just going to be, again, in my same resource group with a different name. And then it has this public-facing website now because, again, it's going to be backed by an app service. So like you set up an app service, you're setting up a Logic app here. Or just like you set up an Azure Function app, same thing. Now you need an app service plan. And so again, you can choose any plan you want, but again, I just chose a free one. And I think the reason that this is really interesting is because this might actually make it quite a lot easier to deploy to different environments for your Logic apps now that they're going to be backed by these app services. So again, this is just deployed out there, and then I'm able to go in and I'm actually disabling my other two so they don't continue to run at this point, just to save some money. And while that was actually provisioning. So once it's provisioned, then I can go to workflows, just like you go to Azure Functions in a function app. It's called workflows here. So you just create your workflow here. I'm choosing a stateful, and I'll do another one quick that's just going to be a stateless. So you can see now I can group logic apps, and each one of those works very similar to what we already just saw in the old logic apps, where it has its code and its designer, an attachment to monitor. You can then use your triggers, connectors, and such, just like you would with a regular logic app right here. And now you have a group of logic apps together. So I think I made a mistake here on the actual trigger, trying to set something up instead of using the right trigger, which is, again, my lack of experience with these. So I was actually just wanting to respond so that when an HTTP request is received is what I wanted there. Once I saved that, then I'm able to get more information and be able to do stuff. So this is just showing that I can use a variable in the stateful version and I can't in the stateless, basically. So again, just trying to show that there is a difference, and this is just going to try to use a variable and it won't be able to find them. No such thing. Interesting. So if you're looking for something you don't see it, you might want to check if you're in a stateless or a stateful logic app workflow. So I think these are mostly supposed to be used as pass-throughs, respond to the request, and then pass that information on to someone else. Or basically process a message from service bus or something simple like that and trigger other things. So what's interesting is you get deployment slots on different plans as well. So just like you'd have deployment slots with the app services, then there's the deployment center. And I have not looked into this enough to understand what these are doing yet. But again, I think the idea being here that deploying a regular logic app with the JSON has been kind of clunky. You have to do a group template or a group deployment. I think what we're going for here is more of a flow that you would see like if you were doing a web app or a function app where you have the ability to actually build these things in pipelines and push them into different environments very easily. So you see they have the full public facing, and when you run it, it just says, hey, your functions app is running. So you can see that they've kind of built that on top of that same. All right, so we have just a few minutes. I wanted to, if we had enough time, I wanted to just pull up the portal real quick just to show you that. So again, it's very easy to get into these. You can easily see your logic apps that are out there, and you can dive into any part of it and easily work with those. You can export your template at any point. And if you had, wanted to create another one really quickly that was able to respond to an HTTP post, you could do that, which is what I was going to do here, but we don't have enough time to do that and take questions. So I'm going to go ahead and just move on from that. But basically today we looked at logic apps, saw the moving pieces, recognized that we need triggers, connectors, and actions. So we chained a couple together. We were able to respond to Twitter. We were able to send an email. We were able to do whatever we want, really. That's just what we did here. And we integrated Secrets and Key Vault to show that it's very easy to work with other services. So again, there's some connection information for me. And if you have questions, I'd love to hear them.
Awesome stuff. Thank you very much, Brian. So yeah, folks, if anybody out there has questions, unmute. There's always a moment at the end of these talks where you're like, everything is silent. Does that mean everybody has achieved complete understanding or no one can find the mute button? Martin, I believe you had some questions.
Well, a lot of them were covered, and I think it revolves around the new preview ones, because $4,000 a month is a little bit extortionate to run a couple of functions to run some scheduled tasks. So being able to run it in App Service Plan, I think that was something I wasn't aware of, the preview stuff. So yeah, that cool. Probably answers most of my questions, to be honest.
Nice. Yeah, I'm not a super expert on those yet because they're fairly new and I need to look into them more, but it seems like a really interesting paradigm they're moving to.
Is there any local development scenario that you can use for these, or is it everything has to be run in production?
So, yeah, I mean, when we did it, for our real world scenario, we just developed it in a test environment at Azure, and just kind of did that. Again, I didn't have a lot of luck using it in the Visual Studio IDE. You can actually develop them locally in your Visual Studio IDE with the Logic App tools. But I found it was just easier to just do stuff out at Azure. So we set up a test environment and did it that way. Just kind of ran it as test against test data. And then once we were done with that, then we had the pain of moving that into staging, and then the pain of moving that into production, because again, it was all just JSON templates at that point, trying to get things in. And one way we did it at first, before we didn't even use the ARM templates, we just literally went in, grabbed that code from the code view, pasted it into a new Logic app for the staging environment, and then just changed a few of the variables behind the scenes, which is wonky, but it works. But it would be a lot better if you're trying to automate to use the deployment templates, the ARM templates. So that's the only way I can think of doing it. I don't know that you can run it locally, but maybe now with the app service option.
You can run Azure functions locally, so
yeah,
potentially that's opening up that scenario.
Yeah, and maybe you can do it through that Visual Studio IDE tool as well. Maybe they let you, but it seems like it just kind of deploys them out to Azure. So.
I have also a question, maybe a strange question. And what's the difference between Azure Logic App and the Microsoft Flow and the O365, and when should I use what?
So the Microsoft Flow, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the difference between Microsoft Flow and Azure Logic Apps, because it's kind of the same, but not exactly the same, if I understand well.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Flow. Is that in the BI world?
It's in the O365 world, so yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe it's just the same, but that is more for Azure stuff, and the other thing is more for Office applications. But I think the concept is the same. Maybe we can translate on that way.
Yeah, I think what I've thought about in the past is that the Flow in the BI world would be more for your non-developers, more your BAs and your people who are used to working with business data, whereas hopefully, the Logic app itself is more designed for a developer. But that might be a very, very shallow way to look at it, to be honest. I have not used the Flow, so. I saw there's a couple questions here in Slack as well. Biz talking in the cloud. Our business activities monitoring feature available in Logic Apps. So you could use your Logic Apps to connect to any of your services or any of your on-premises devices as well. So you could actually set up things like, monitoring your business activities or checking messages or whatever you need to do to respond to those with your Logic Apps. And then can we use it with user access tokens and use their consent to send email as rather than use SendGrid mailbox? Oh, you can do whatever you want. You can actually connect to your O365 to send email. You could connect to Gmail. You could do whatever you need to do to send the email, or you could even trigger a function that does what you need to do. So if you had a function already set up to send your emails, you could easily just call that function from your Logic app, just passing the information you need it to do. Cool.
All right.
All right.